It was a chilly, quiet morning on the outskirts of a small rural town. The kind of morning that felt still, where the only sound you could hear was the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional creak of an old barn door swinging in the breeze. But for one man, a millionaire who owned a sprawling farm, this particular morning would forever change the course of his life. As the sun began to rise, casting golden rays across his land, he did what he did every day. He made his way to his barn to check on the animals. He had spent years building this farm from the ground up, a life shaped by hard work and determination. Little did he know, today would bring an unexpected encounter that would shake him to his core. When he opened the barn door, he wasn't prepared for what he saw. There, in the corner of the barn, curled up on a pile of hay, was a young girl. She was no older than 15, her clothes ragged and worn, her face pale, and her hair tangled. She appeared to be sound asleep, as if the barn had become her only refuge in the world. The millionaire's heart sank. How could a girl so young end up here, alone, in a place so far removed from the safety of family and home? He stood frozen for a moment, processing what he was seeing. His mind raced. Was she lost? Abandoned? Who could have left her here, in the cold and unforgiving barn, with nothing but a thin layer of hay to protect her from the chill of the night? He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. The farm was isolated, miles away from the nearest town. Whoever she was, she must have been struggling. Slowly, almost cautiously, he stepped forward. The girl didn't stir, and for a moment, he thought she might be sick or in some kind of deep sleep from exhaustion. He knelt beside her, looking her over more closely. There were faint bruises on her arms, dirt smudged across her face. She was clearly in need of help. A sense of responsibility washed over him. His instincts kicked in. He couldn't just leave her here. This wasn't a place for a young girl to be. Without hesitation, he gently shook her shoulder, his voice soft but firm as he whispered, "Hey, are you okay?" The girl's eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, she stared up at him, confusion and fear evident in her eyes. It wasn't the look of someone who had been expecting help. It was the look of someone who had been running, hiding, or perhaps someone who had given up on the idea of anyone ever coming for her. She sat up quickly, almost instinctively, pulling her knees to her chest as if to protect herself. The millionaire could see the panic in her eyes. She didn't know who he was, and she certainly didn't know if she could trust him. But he didn't pull away. He stayed calm, offering a reassuring smile, hoping to ease her fear. "I won't hurt you," he said, his voice steady, trying to put her at ease. "I found you here, and I'm just trying to help. You don't have to be afraid." The girl hesitated, glancing around the barn as if expecting someone to appear from the shadows. But the barn was empty, just hay, old farm equipment, and the smell of animals. Finally, after a long, tense silence, she spoke in a barely audible voice. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to be here. I don't know where else to go." The millionaire's heart tightened. There it was, the raw honesty in her voice that told him everything he needed to know. This was a girl who had no place to go, no one to turn to. He couldn't imagine the kind of pain she must have been carrying. But right now, he could offer her something: safety, warmth, and a chance to feel like a person again, not just a nameless face in the cold. He extended his hand to her, the gesture simple but genuine. "Come with me," he said softly. "I'll take you inside the house. You can rest there, get something to eat, and we can figure things out from there." The girl looked up at him, uncertain but desperate. She needed help, and here, in this isolated place, he seemed to be the only person who could offer it. She hesitated for only a moment longer before taking his hand, allowing him to help her to her feet. As they made their way toward the farmhouse, the millionaire couldn't help but wonder, who was she? What had brought her to his barn, and why was she alone? There was a story here, one that was far more complex than anything he could imagine. He knew one thing for sure: her appearance on his farm was no accident. But the more he thought about it, the more questions began to swirl in his mind. The girl had seemed so lost, so vulnerable, but there was something about her eyes, something in the way she looked at him, that hinted at more than just a child in need of rescue. He didn't know if it was fear, wariness, or something else, but there was a sense of guardedness in her that he couldn't ignore. Inside the warmth of his house, the millionaire set the girl down at the kitchen table and went to prepare some food for her. He wanted to make her feel as comfortable as possible, even if only for a brief moment. She needed to feel safe, to know that there were people who cared. But just as he placed a plate of food in front of her and sat down across from her, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. It was as if the story that had brought this girl to his doorstep was only just beginning, and he had no idea what would come next. As the minutes passed in silence, the tension between them grew, the unsaid words lingering in the air. What would she say? What would happen next? And what secrets was this young girl hiding behind those guarded eyes? This was just the beginning, and for the millionaire, the questions were only getting started. As the girl sat at the kitchen table, picking at her food, the millionaire couldn't stop his mind from racing. He had offered her safety, warmth, and a chance to rest. But something about her was still off, like a piece of the puzzle was missing. She had barely said a word since they sat down, her eyes darting nervously around the room, as if she was constantly waiting for something to happen. He watched her carefully, trying to figure out how to approach the situation. It was clear she wasn't used to being cared for, not in any real way. Her movements were stiff, like she was afraid someone might come barging in at any moment. He couldn't help but feel a deep sympathy for her. But at the same time, a feeling of unease crept up his spine. "What's your name?" he finally asked, his voice soft. He didn't want to pressure her, but he needed to know who she was. If he was going to help her, he had to understand what she had been through. The girl hesitated, her fingers curling around the edge of the plate as she stared down at the food. The silence stretched on for several long moments before she finally spoke. "Emily," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My name is Emily." The millionaire nodded, absorbing the name, but he didn't push her further. The girl clearly wasn't ready to open up about herself, and he knew better than to force her. Instead, he tried to make the conversation more comfortable. "Where are you from, Emily?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "How did you end up in my barn?" At the mention of the barn, Emily's face seemed to change, her eyes hardening just a little. It was subtle, but he caught it. There was something about the question that unsettled her, something she wasn't ready to talk about. She looked at him, then quickly turned her gaze toward the window, as if trying to find an escape. "I was just running," she murmured, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke. "I didn't have anywhere else to go." The words hung in the air, and the millionaire sat back, his mind racing. Running? Running from what? From who? It was clear that Emily wasn't just lost. There was more to this story, something darker. But before he could press further, she stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I need to go," she said, her voice more forceful now, her eyes wide with fear. "I can't stay here." The millionaire stood quickly, reaching out to stop her. "No, you're not going anywhere. You're safe here." But Emily shook her head, taking a step back. Her eyes were wide now, filled with panic, and her hands were clenched into fists at her sides. "I can't," she whispered. "I can't stay here. I have to leave." Her sudden outburst startled him, and for the first time, he saw the true depth of her fear. It wasn't just the fear of being alone, of being vulnerable. It was the fear of something or someone chasing her. Something that was driving her to run, to hide, to keep moving. "Emily, please," he said, his voice more urgent now. "You're safe here. No one's going to hurt you. I just want to help." But Emily was shaking her head again, more violently this time. "You don't understand," she said, her voice breaking. "I can't stay in one place too long. They'll find me." The millionaire's heart raced. Who's going to find you?" But Emily's gaze flicked to the door, her breath coming in quick gasps, as if she was listening for something. For a moment, there was a strange, almost eerie quiet in the room. Then, as if on cue, a faint sound came from outside the house, just a distant thud, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching the front door. Emily froze, her eyes wide with terror. She spun toward the door, her body tense, her whole posture screaming that she was about to bolt. The millionaire's blood ran cold. Whatever she was running from, it was real, and it was closing in fast. With a final glance at him, Emily bolted for the back door, her feet pounding across the wooden floors. The millionaire rushed after her, but by the time he reached the back door, she was already gone, disappearing into the darkness outside. The door slammed shut behind her, and he stood there for a moment, breathless, his mind racing. He had no idea who was after her or why she had run off. But one thing was clear, he had to find her before it was too late. He grabbed his coat, determined to bring her back. As he stepped outside into the cold night air, a chill ran through him. But it wasn't just the weather. He was no longer just a bystander in this story. He was part of it now. And whatever Emily was running from, he knew he couldn't let her face it alone. The chase was on. The night air was biting as the millionaire ran through the farmyard, his boots crunching against the frozen ground. Emily's silhouette had already disappeared into the distance, and he could barely make out where she had gone. His heart pounded in his chest as he rushed to follow her, his mind swirling with a mix of fear and confusion. He had to catch up to her. He couldn't let her run off into the unknown again, especially not with whatever danger was looming. But the further he ran, the harder it was to track her. The darkness wrapped around him like a heavy blanket, and the only sounds were the wind and his own breath. He didn't even know which direction to go. He was losing her, and with every passing second, he feared he might be too late. And then, just as he was about to call out her name again, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was her. Emily stood in the middle of a small clearing, her face pale and strained, her body rigid as if she was preparing for a confrontation. But it wasn't just her presence that caught the millionaire's attention. It was the other figures emerging behind her, their silhouettes just as menacing in the darkness. "Emily," the millionaire called out, his voice thick with urgency. "You don't have to do this. Come back inside." But Emily didn't turn to him. She stood tall, as if she was prepared to face whatever was coming. The millionaire's pulse quickened as one of the figures stepped forward, a tall man with a cold, calculating look in his eyes. The others flanked him, moving in a way that was almost methodical, as if they were used to controlling the situation. "You should have stayed inside," the man said, his voice low and dangerous. "Now you've put us all in a very complicated position." Emily flinched but didn't retreat. Her eyes flicked toward the millionaire, and for a brief moment there was a flicker of something like regret in her gaze. But then she turned her attention back to the man in front of her. "Leave them out of this," she said, her voice shaking but defiant. "I won't go back with you. I'll never go back." The millionaire's mind was racing. What was happening? Who were these people, and why were they so intent on taking Emily? He could see the fear in her eyes, but there was something else too, a sense of resolve. She wasn't going down without a fight, and that made him realize just how deep this went. "What do you want with her?" the millionaire asked, his voice sharp, demanding an answer. The tall man eyed him coldly, sizing him up. "She belongs to us," he said simply. "She's a part of something much bigger than you understand. And now you've made yourself part of it too." The words hit the millionaire like a punch in the gut. Part of something bigger. He had no idea what they meant, but one thing was clear: these weren't ordinary people. They had power, they had influence, and they were willing to do whatever it took to get what they wanted. Before he could react, Emily stepped forward, her voice strong and filled with determination. "No, I won't be anyone's possession," she shouted. "I'm not going back to you." And that's when everything changed. In a sudden, unexpected move, Emily reached into her jacket and pulled out something small and shiny, an object the millionaire couldn't quite make out at first. But then, the man who had been leading the group's eyes widened, and his expression shifted from one of cold control to one of panic. "No," he shouted, his voice cracking. "Put that down. You don't know what you're—" But it was too late. With a sharp click, Emily activated the device. In an instant, the figures around her froze, their eyes glazing over as if a switch had been flipped. The millionaire watched in stunned silence as the strange men dropped to their knees, immobilized, completely under her control. It was like something out of a movie, something impossible, yet somehow real. Emily turned to the millionaire, her face now resolute, but there was still a trace of sadness in her eyes. They were never going to stop coming after me, she said quietly, her voice steady but tinged with regret. I had no choice. I've been running for so long. The millionaire took a step closer to her, his mind reeling. What are they? And what is that thing you just used? Emily lowered her gaze, as if unsure whether to tell him. But the moment felt like it couldn't be avoided any longer. I'm not who I said I was, she admitted softly. I've been living in hiding, trying to escape from them. They're part of a network, a group with far-reaching influence. They control people, manipulate them, use them for things they don't even understand. I was one of their experiments, and I ran. I ran because I couldn't let them control me anymore. The millionaire's world tilted. He had no words. He had thought she was just a girl in trouble. But the reality was far darker. Emily wasn't just some runaway. She was part of something deeply dangerous, something far beyond his understanding. You're free now, she said, her voice shaking slightly. But they'll come looking for me. They'll never stop until they get what they want. Before he could respond, she turned toward the immobilized figures, looking back at him one last time. I'm sorry, but you can't be involved any further, she said, a note of finality in her tone. You're in danger now, and I can't let that happen. And just like that, without another word, she disappeared into the night, vanishing into the shadows where the millionaire could no longer reach her. The men who had been pursuing her lay motionless, their control lost. But the threat still loomed over the millionaire's head. He knew that Emily had done what she had to do to protect herself, but the question lingered in his mind. Was he truly safe? Or had he just stepped into a world far more dangerous than he ever realized? As the moonlight faded behind the clouds, the millionaire stood alone in the clearing, his thoughts heavy with the weight of the secrets he had uncovered. Emily's story wasn't over, and somehow, neither was his. But for now, all he could do was wait, because the real battle, he feared, was only just beginning.